In Miranda v. Arizona, the Supreme Court ruled that detained criminal suspects, prior to police questioning, must be informed of their constitutional right to an attorney and against self-incrimination. Roe v. Wade ruled unconstitutional a state law that banned abortions except to save the life of the mother. In Texas v. Johnson, it was a case in which the Supreme Court ruled that the burning of the U.S. flag was constitutionally protected form of free speech under the First Amendment. Adkins v. Virginia is a case in which the Supreme Court of the United States ruled 6-3 that executing mentally retarded individuals violates the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, but states can define who is mentally retarded. Roper v. Simmons was a landmark decision in which the Supreme Court of the United States held that it is unconstitutional to impose capital punishment for crimes committed while under the age of 18. The 5-4 decision overruled the court's prior ruling upholding such sentences on offenders above or at the age of 16 in Stanford v. Kentucky, overturning statutes in 25 states that had the penalty set lower. Duncan v. Louisiana was a significant United States Supreme Court decision which incorporated the Sixth Amendment right to jury trial and applied it to the states. Lee v. Weissman was a United States Supreme Court decision regarding school prayer. It was the first major school prayer case decided by the Rehnquist Court. It ruled that schools may not sponsor clerics to conduct even non-denominational prayer. The court followed a board interpretation of the Establishment Clause that had been a standard for decades at the nation's highest court, a reaffirmation of principles of such landmark cases as Engel v. Vitale and Abington v. Schempp. United States v. Miller was a Supreme Court case that involved a Second Amendment challenge to the National Firearms Act of 1934. Miller is often cited in the ongoing American gun politics debate, as both sides claim that it supports their position. New Jersey v. TLO is a decision by the United States Supreme Court addressing the constitutionality of a search of a public high school student for contraband after she was caught smoking. District of Columbia v. Heller was a landmark case in which the Supreme Court of the United States held in a 5-4 decision that the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution applies to federal enclaves and protects an individual's rights to possess a firearm for traditional lawful purposes, such as self-defense within the home. The decision did not address the question of whether the Second Amendment extends beyond federal enclaves to the states, which was addressed later by McDonald v. Chicago. It was the first Supreme Court case to decide whether the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to bear arms for self-defense. Board of Education v. Earls was a United States Supreme Court case in which the court upheld the constitutionality of mandatory drug testing by public schools of students participating in extracurricular activities. Brandsburg v. Hayes was a landmark United States Supreme Court decision invalidating the use of the First Amendment as a defense for reporters summoned to testify before a grand jury. Gideon v. Wainwright is a landmark case in United States Supreme Court history. In it, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that state courts are required under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution to provide counsel in criminal cases to represent defendants who are unable to afford to pay their own attorneys. Ingraham v. Wright was a United States Supreme Court case that upheld the disciplinary corporal punishment policy of Florida's public schools by a 5-4 vote. Engel v. Vitale was a landmark United States Supreme Court case that ruled it is unconstitutional for state officials to compose an official school prayer and encourage its recitation in public schools. Tinker v. Des Moines was a decision by the United States Supreme Court that defined the constitutional rights of students in United States public schools. The Tinker test is still used by courts today to determine whether schools' disciplinary actions violate students' First Amendment rights. The case of Rotary International versus Rotary Club of Duarte illustrates how the Supreme Court weighs the First Amendment right to private association and expressive association against government anti-discrimination laws that are associated to interfere with those rights. Mapp v. Ohio was a landmark case in criminal procedure in which the United States Supreme Court decided that evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, may not be used in any state law criminal prosecutions in state courts, as well as had previously been the law as in federal criminal law prosecutions in the federal courts. The Supreme Court accomplished this by using a principle known as selective incorporation. In Mapp, this involved the incorporation of the provisions as interpreted by the court of the Fourth Amendment, which are applicable only to actions of the federal government, into the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, which is applicable to actions of the states. The decision allowed Florida Secretary of State Katherine Harris's previous certification of George W. Bush as the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes to stand. Florida's votes gave Bush, the Republican candidate, 271 of the required 270 electoral votes to win the Electoral College and defeat Democrat candidate Al Gore, who received 266 votes. A District of Columbia elector abstained. Media organizations subsequently analyzed the ballots, and under the strategy that Al Gore pursued at the beginning of the Florida recount, filing suit to force hand recounts in 4 predominant Democratic counties. Bush would have kept his lead, according to the ballot review conducted by the Consultorium. California v. Greenwood was a case in which the Supreme Court of the United States held that the Fourth Amendment does not prohibit the warrantless search and seizure of garbage left for collection outside the curtilage of a home. Escodibo v. Illinois was a United States Supreme Court case holding the criminal suspects have a right to counsel during police interrogations under the Sixth Amendment. The case was decided years after the court held in Gideon v. Wainwright that indignant criminal defendants had a right to be provided counsel at trial. Vernonia School District v. Acton was a Supreme Court case decision which upheld the constitutionality of random drug testing regimen implemented by local high schools in Vernonia, Oregon. Under that regimen, student athletes were required to submit random drug tests before being allowed to participate in sports. During the season, 10% of all athletes were selected for drug testing. The Supreme Court held that although the tests were searches under the Fourth Amendment, they were reasonable in light of the school's interest in preventing teenage drug use. New York Times Company v. Sullivan was a United States Supreme Court case that established the actual malice standard, which has to be met before press reports about public officials can be considered to be defamation and libel, and hence allowed free reporting of the civil rights campaigns in the southern United States. It is one of the key decisions supporting the freedom of the press. The actual malice standard requires that the plaintiff in a defamation or libel case prove that the publisher of the statement in question knew that the statement was false or acted in reckless disregard of its truth or felicity. Because of the extremely high burden of proof on the plaintiff, the difficulty of proving the defendant's knowledge and intentions, such cases when they involve public officials rarely prevail. Brown v. Board of Education, Topeka was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. The decision overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which allowed state-sponsored segregation insofar as it applied to public education. Handed down on May 17, 1954, the Warrens Court unanimous 9-0 decision stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. As a result, de jure racial segregation was ruled a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory for the civil rights movement. Coker v. Georgia held that the Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution forbade the death penalty for the crime of rape. Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission is a United States constitutional law case dealing with the regulation of campaign spending by organizations. The United States Supreme Court held that the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent political expenditures by a nonprofit corporation. The principles articulated by the Supreme Court in the case have also been extended for profit corporations, labor unions, and other associations. Loving v. Virginia was a landmark civil rights decision of the United States Supreme Court, which invalidated laws prohibiting interracial marriage. Schenck v. United States is a United States Supreme Court decision concerning enforcement of the Espionage Act of 1917 during World War I. A unanimous Supreme Court, in a famous opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., concluded that defendants who distributed leaflets to draft-age men urging resistance to induction could be convicted of an attempt to obstruct a draft, a criminal offense. The First Amendment did not alter the well-established law in cases where the attempt was made through expressions that would be protected in other circumstances. In this opinion, Holmes said that expressions which in the circumstances were intended to result in a crime and pose a clear and present danger of succeeding could be punished. Apodaca v. Oregon was a United States Supreme Court case in which the court held that the state juries may convict a criminal defendant by less than unanimity, even though federal law requires that federal juries must reach verdicts unanimously. The four-justice plurality opinion of the court, written by Justice White, affirmed the judgment of the Oregon Court of Appeals and held that there was no constitutional right to unanimous verdict. Thus, Oregon's law did not violate due process. United States v. Alfonso D. Lopez, Jr. was the first United States Supreme Court case since the New Deal to set limits to Congress's power under the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution.